I think we'll get started now. I'm Josie from Richmond Landcare. I'd just like to say we normally do our events in farm sheds, so this is quite the upgrade. And it was put together in a bit of a hurry, so we had some issues with the venue being a bit too small, so we've shifted here, and I'd really like to thank Southern Cross University for giving us this venue and their AV technicians for free. It's really great. I'd also like to thank NRCF and the Byron Community Centre via the Flood Relief Fund for providing a grant for us to run this event. And also to the speakers for generously donating your time, really appreciate it. And I'd also like to thank Emma Stone, who's been helping out with putting this together from Border Rangers Richmond Valley Landcare. Emma's going to be getting around taking some photos, so if you don't want to be in the photos, just let her know and she'll make sure she doesn't get you. The event is also going to be live streamed on Zoom, so if you don't want your questions included in that, then perhaps ask them after the event. Those people watching on Zoom can type their questions into Zoom and Emma will read them out during the questions. We've also got morning tea out the back there, so if anyone wants to have some morning tea after the event, please do. There's no food in the theatre, unfortunately. There's toilets, men's toilets up the back and women's toilets somewhere around there. And we've allowed quite a lot of time for questions. So I know you've probably got lots of questions, so feel free to ask. We have civil engineer Steve who is a fellow of Engineers Australia, Steve Passelt, in the audience. So if anyone has any questions about civil engineering, he's available to answer questions, and he can also talk about what's changing under climate change. And after the questions, you'll have the opportunity to walk up to Block R, which is that way, and we'll have a look at a small landslide. And Wayne Walshe will do a demonstration of a hydro mulcher on the landslip. It's a steep walk, so please watch your step, and please stand to the side of the base of the landslide. And the hydro mulcher is also quite loud. We recognise that this event might be bringing up some traumatic memories, and it might be quite triggering for some people. We have a couple of people here who are counsellors from the New South Wales Local Health District Disaster Recovery Team. If they can put their hands up, wherever they are, they're up the back there. If anyone needs to, have a chat, please feel free to see them. I'm going to hand over now to Traditional Custodian Gilbert Laurie to give a welcome to country.
Yeah, Google Bear, Josie. Thank you. I'll just try and grab this off. This is better. Anyway, Jingi Walla, Blagame Yowe. Hello, everyone. And I'd like to acknowledge the land we are gathered upon. I should have said Jingi Walla Naling Na Wujibul Jogan. All right. Naling Na Banjalang Jogan. So I'd like to acknowledge the land we are gathered upon. This is what we call our Wujibul land. So I am a Wujibul descendant of our country. We are known as a Waibal people of our land, Yoe. The Waibal people are, see, the Wujibul is our fire stick. Waibal, what we call our fire is Webra. Webra de Galaningala. So we also use it as Waibal. So to us, we are the Wujibul people of our great big nation, the Bunjalung Nation, and we are the keepers of the fire. All right. So I do a lot of smoking ceremonies with my welcome to country. I asked Josie, could I do one today? I have done one here in this place before, but I haven't been inside because of the smoke alarms. All right. So I usually do attract the fire brigade. All right, when I do these smoking events. So yeah, it's a very sad thing what happened in our country. I'd like to acknowledge my elders who walked before us. Acknowledge my elders past, present, and I look at my young people as our emerging elders. I am an educator. I have got a book of knowledge inside of me, and that book of knowledge is not written down. It was passed down to us, all right? The knowledge which was passed down to us thousands and thousands of years is our connection to our country. All right? We have heard of stories of big floods in the past, what have happened in our country. So this is the first time. I grew up in Lismore. We know Lismore as in our language as Dundarimba. Dundarimba means swampland. All right. When they colonised our country, the old people warned them not to build down on Dundarimba, build up on the hills because of the swamp and our water catchments out in our mountains. We got a lot of water catchments out there, all right? They run into this river system, you know, as a Wilson, Richmond River. We call this river in our language, it's called Marmon, all right? We call the river Bullina, so Ballina is the place of the big river in our language. So all our waterways here end up down into that ocean down there, which is known as the Pacific Ocean. We call that the Buraka. That's the Pacific Ocean. So for us to hear these stories of our old people sharing our stories in the past of big water rising, and that's how we connect with our land, because we got stories which connect to our waterways. All right. I live out out there at Nimbin. For us to see the water coming out there from our water catchments, flying off our mountains, coming to these forks of these rivers, and because I was saying to my missus on that Thursday night before this big rain event happened, I said to her, I said, darling, this levee wall is not going to hold back this flood. All right. And I was saying that on a Thursday. Because when I grew up in Lismore, we did not have the levee wall. All right. The 74 flood, I was only a young boy, but I still remember that very clearly because we were running around being mischievous little young boys. And we used to run around in the flood exploring it, like every young kid like to do. And we see the water right come through our town back then. It come in slowly. The levee wall was not there. All right. Because that levee wall was there, I know it done a lot of damage because it cascaded into our town. And the power of water, nothing can hold water back. All right, so to see all the damaged infrastructure, what I see when I come into my town I grew up in, and to see the sadness and the trauma within all the people, yeah, it's very sad to see what happened in our beautiful country. A lot of landslips. Soon as the rain stopped, we got a chance to get on our roads. We had to the local mob from out Nimbin, we had the community coming together to clear our roads, clear our bridges, so we could travel on our roads. So when we had the opportunity, when the rain stopped, me and my missus jumped in the car and we went for a drive, and to see all the landslips out there and the destruction of our roads was very sad to see, and all these people who were stuck in their communities, they could not get out because of the landslips. We even lost a lot of our roads. I don't think we'll ever see some of our roads get rebuilt again because they just slid away on us. So it's going to be a lot of healing to do. So I did get a chance to have a talk to the Mayor of Lismore, Steve Craig, and we had a good conversation about how we're going to sustain our waterways and look after it. Well, if we can work together, come and ask the First Nations peoples for a bit of knowledge, all right? Because we have got a bit of knowledge inside of us about our country, and we'd like to share it with everyone. because we're all here. Look, we're not going nowhere. We just got to live with each other and care for each other and understand each other and believe in the First Nations people. We know our country. We've been here for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. We have got connection to our land. We know where our waterway starts. All right. The 4 rivers, which is bounded by our nation. The Clarence River goes all the way up to the Logan River. That's where our bounded by our nation. We go over the Queensland border, the Bundjalung Nation. And our 4 waterway starts from a very special place. Up there, you know it as Mount Lindsay, at a place called Woodenbong. Well, we call that mountain is Jumbagum. And that is a mountain of the start of our 4 waterways. So when we look at our waterways and we look at the special mountain, they're always talking about building a dam in our nation. Well, come and talk to the First Nations people and we'll help you build a dam. It's all about consulting and talking with each other. We can look after and sustain our beautiful country, Because for me, being a teacher, I'm an educator and I love to go into schools and I teach the little ones. I share our language, I share our stories. They are our next generation. We teach the little ones, we get it into their heads to look after our country, sustain our waterways, sustain our trees. Because when they come and colonised our country, they did a lot of damage by taking away our native trees and replacing them with these other introduced plants, which is not adaptable to our country. So when we do look at a lot of these landslips, if we can try and put some native plants back into our land to hold it tight, bring it back, then the land might come back and heal. And we can bring it together by healing it together and sharing it together. All right. So I'm not gonna stay here all day and talk to you because this is all about the landslip and you guys, because I got other things to do. I got another welcome to country to do. I'm a busy man within the community. All right. But it's like I said, it's working with the community and to talk to the Mayor of Lismore, and we have this conversation. We're talking about holding an eeling gathering in the future. So maybe in the future we can look at holding an eeling gathering and bringing us all together and share our stories, share music, share our food together. Let's have fun together. Let's try and get rid of that sadness we don't want around us no more. All right. Anyway, thank you again. Boogle Bear. I say Boogle Bear in my language. Can we all say Boogle Bear? Yeah, Boogle Bear. It's so easy, Learn one word on behalf of the First Nations people, and that's an easy word to learn. Boogle Bear, thank you, all right? And Garamara Gala Ningala Jogan, yeah? Garamara Gala Ningala Jogan. So Garamara is respecting. Jogan is the land, all right? We all respect our land together, all right? We're not, like I said, we're not going nowhere, all right? I'm a proud Widjabul man as I walk this country. I'm also from my other nation is over Yamba. We are known as the Yeregal people. We work with a mob over there, sustaining our country, working together. We work with national parks and wildlife. We work with the Landcare groups within our country. So it's all about consulting and understanding and talking with each other. So easy to do. All right. So thanks again and enjoy your day. All right. Thanks again. Boogle.
Thanks to Gilbert for that welcome. It's a fantastic insight. And really, I could have listened to him for the rest of the day, actually. But anyway, in the absence of that, you're going to have to listen to us. So I will start. I'm just going to do the simple part of this set of presentations, talking about the underlying mechanisms that lead to mass movement or to landslide. It's a relatively simple process until you get out in the field, and then the complexity starts to become a little bit more apparent. But I will stick to the simple stuff. So I'm going to want to talk about the underlying mechanisms that lead to landslip, some indicators or predictors of the likelihood of landslide occurring, and then very briefly introduce the management of landslides. At a technical level, you can talk about, and we can divide landslides into a number of different terms. So we can define them in terms of the material that's moving, whether it's mud, earth, debris, or rock, and the mechanism of the movement itself: falls, slides, slumps, flows, and creeps. Now, we don't really want to get involved in the complexity, but it means that you can get a whole range of different landslides that we lump all together as landslides. So you can get mud flows, mudslides, mud creeps, etc., etc. So that term landslide basically covers this vast array of more technical terms, but we won't get overly caught up with those technical terms. And that picture there just shows the outcome of landslides over an extended period. So you can see a whole lot of recovered landslides within that landscape, which, and as we'll talk about later, the presence of past landslides is obviously a clear predictor for future landslides. So having that understanding and the capacity to see landslides, old landslides in the landscape, is really important in predicting the likelihood of future landslides. The impacts of landslides, okay, so potential injury and loss of life. Of course, we have the Thredbo disaster, which was the worst landslide disaster in Australia. I think 18 people died there. Of course, much larger landslides have led to much larger death counts. I think there was one in China in the 1920s that led to about 200,000 people dying. That was prompted by an earthquake. Other than that, have loss of topsoil. So I'm actually a soil scientist. I probably should have introduced myself. I'm a soil scientist. So it's that loss of the soil, the upper part of the debris that flows in one of these landslides is what I'm interested in. It exposes subsoil, the loss of that topsoil, that really important skin on the planet, in a planet that is already threatened, is a really important loss as well. Infrastructure damage, roads, etc., as Uncle Gilbert was talking about, but houses and other infrastructure. And then also other environmental damage, such as the damage to our waterways. And you only had to walk through or be in and around Lismore post-flood to see the amount of soil that was being carted away from our productive farmlands and impacting on our productivity. So that was a real issue. Much of that was from landslides. Many of our landslides were directly into creeks, and of course, having a lot of impact on the freshwater systems, which then of course flows down into our marine systems. Okay, so let's talk about some of the factors that lead to mass movement. The key factors really are slope angle, the strength of the material that is moving, and water content. Fairly simple. So steeper slopes tend to mean a higher likelihood of landslip, obviously, and the cohesion of the materials that are potentially slipping. So I'm going to call that regolith. So regolith is basically anything above hard rock. So it will include materials, soil at the top, but a whole range of materials below that. Some of this regolith can be tens of meters deep. In other places, it might only be a metre or so. But when we're talking about landslip, we're generally talking about the movement of the regolith, anything above that hard rock. Hard rock's pretty stable, okay? So unless it's fractured, it's not going to move. It's the material above that we're really talking about. And then water content. Water content plays a really important role. In some cases, it's easier actually to think about not what makes landslip, but what keeps it in place. I mean, gravity is pushing stuff downhill, down slope. So why doesn't stuff move all the time? What's making it hang on that slope? And I think that's an easier way to think of it. So within the slope, we have a number of forces acting. Gravity directly down, and part of that is directed down the slope. and what's holding it there. So the regolith itself at a micro scale is held there by the frictional forces between the soil particles and the rock material, and then the frictional forces between that regolith and the bedrock below, the fractured or unfractured bedrock below. So a reasonably straightforward process, you'd think. And of course, the impact of gravity is changed according to the steepness of the slope. And I think one of the issues is that gravity is getting worse. Over time, anyone that's walked up here from the bottom car park, I've observed gravity over time. I've walked up those steps over 10 or 15 years, and I know that gravity is a lot tougher these days than it was 15 years ago. So gravity, I'm putting it down to climate change. But that's one thing that we do have to cope with. So the gravitational forces are fairly straightforward. As the slope gets steeper, so those stresses become steeper as well. So artificially changing slopes, such as putting in a road cut, also can lead to a slip, obviously. A slope that was previously stable can become unstable, and we'll talk about water. Water is the primary driver of this effect. Earthquakes can input energy, which can overcome some of the cohesive and frictional forces present. Overloading, putting extra mass on a slope, whether it might be a building or trees or anything, has the potential to do that. And as I mentioned, undercutting can also increase slope and increase the likelihood of landslip. Okay, water is a big one. Let's talk about water and the role it plays. So the blue is the mass that we were just talking about, the mass of the regolith, and the yellow I'm saying is the added mass of water within the material on the surface. And that can add as much as 50% or more to the mass of a slope. So you've got a large increase in mass in a saturated regolith. So that's obviously problematic. It also reduces the cohesive forces within the landslip. So the frictional forces are undermined, and therefore you've got less holding it in place, and it provides lubrication and buoyancy. Okay, the buoyancy, the head of water within a soil body is pushing and lifting and basically decreasing the mass of the water, of the soil, of the regolith on the bedrock, and that lifting is part of that process. So let's just have a look at that in a little more detail. So water is not necessarily problematic right from the start. So if you think about, so just a very simple example here. So if you have dry sand, think about some dry sand from the beach, okay, that doesn't have many frictional forces. That sort of, if you pour it out onto a table, it will just fall apart. Initially, the addition of water increases the cohesive forces and binds that sand together. So you add some water, and down there on the bottom right, you can see that now the sand sticks together. So you have an increase in cohesive forces initially when you add water, but then when you get to the point where the particles are separated by a sufficient amount of water, there's no longer any frictional forces at play. The buoyancy effect means that the sand can flow. So you probably see that if you're walking along the beach. Where do you walk? Up the top, it's really dry and powdery and you sink in. If you walk in the water, it's really wet and you sink in. So you walk just along the edge of the waves, okay, where the water is coming up, keeping it moist, but then you've got sufficient time for the majority of the water to drain out from between the particles, allowing them to sit together. So water is a really important part. And of course, if you get a really high rainfall event like we got on the 28th, then it initiates some of these issues. So here we can see a landslip that is being created by some of the things that we've just been talking about. So you've got this micro cohesive effect of the particles, but you've also got this macro cohesive effect. The whole slope is holding itself together. And if you cut through and weaken a part, whoops, sorry, back. Oh, it's not going back. Yes, it is. So if you cut through and weaken part of it, then of course you're undercutting part of the slope and that collapses. In this case, we're also seeing a secondary effect, which is the removal of trees. The trees have been removed from the site, so therefore you've reduced the transpiration rate at the site. Trees can be pumping out a couple of 100 litres per tree per day out of a soil. That is a lot of water coming out of a soil. So if you remove 500 or 600 trees per hectare, then that's a lot of transpirational capacity you're removing. So what was previously a relatively dry slope suddenly becomes a saturated slope and it starts to collapse. And then the third thing that you can see that we're not seeing at this point is that as those roots which provide a physical cohesive impact, so roots that are penetrating through the soil and tie the soil, the regolith, into the bedrock, and together, as those roots rot and break down, we'll see another suite of landslips. So you get a couple of landslips early on, once the trees are removed, then 4 or 5 years down the track, another set of landslips become apparent as the roots break down. Now, this is an issue that we might need to think about post-fire, okay? In 3 or 4 years' time, as some of those heavily impacted fire communities start to die off and the roots start to rot, then there may well be a risk of landslide in those areas as well. So vegetation is really important. It increases the cohesive strength of the regolith material and also reduces water content. Trees are better than shallow-rooted vegetation, and you'd need quite a few trees to make a difference. Now, this is an important, I hope this might be an important outcome of today, is that we can start to think about what tree species are particularly effective or what vegetation species are particularly effective. And certainly there's people in the audience that have got lots of experience about selecting a suite of species that we should be planting to rehabilitate sites, but also to reduce the likelihood of landslip in the future. So that's a couple, so water plays a really big role. Geology is important. So some geologies have lines of weakness along which a slide can occur. So you also have to remember that regolith is not uniform. Within the regolith, there are points within the regolith that will be clays, which can have a lower cohesiveness than some of the material above it, in which case the slide can occur part way down the regolith at the boundary of the clay and the surface material, and that slip can occur there. So the regolith is not uniform, and therefore you have to examine the entire regolith to determine the likelihood of a slip occurring. So a couple of geologies, so where you've got the bedrock strata lying in the same direction of the slope, it can lead to concentration of water at the top of the bedrock, and that can lead to a slip off the slope. Another important site or another important determinant can be where you have got bedrock that's fractured, and that can lead to slips according to those fractures. Now, I won't get too carried away here. I just want to talk about some of the areas where we're seeing slips, or have historically, so north of Lisbon, Lismore all the way up to Nimbin, Kyogle, etc. So we're pretty familiar with those. We won't get too carried away with that. But we can probably talk about some important indicators in terms of geologies. So Lismore basalt was laid out not in one big flow, but in a number of separate flows, and between each flow, the formation of soils began, which means that you ended up with benches, such as we can see here. So there's a bench, another one on top of that, another one on top of that. And you can see the green associated with the where the two benches join. That's where water is penetrating down through the fractured bedrock and coming out as springs along these sites here. You can also, so these areas become potential landslip sites because you've got concentration of water within the landscape, and any concentration of water within the landscape, whether it's artificial or natural, potentially leads to landslip. And you can also again see this fairly hummocky terrain, which is associated with old landslips. Again, so that's showing the same sorts of things occurring. And this demonstrates this really hummocky terrain. Woo, woo. Oh, now I'm right back to where I started. So my thumb's too big. It's hitting 2 or 3 buttons at the same time. Okay, back where we started. So we'll keep going. Another geology that can be really prone to landslips are the Walloon coal measures. So people out near Nimbin are on Walloon coal measures. I mean, they're fairly extensive. They're really prone to movement. They can move at really low slopes. And so you're seeing here a bit of a flow occurring. It's liquefied and moving across the landscape in a liquefied form. In steep areas, even hard materials are likely to slip. And then where you have volcanic rocks overlying sedimentary rocks. So this is the Richmond Range. You can see that the basalt here is overlying some sedimentary material here. Lots of old slips. I haven't been up there since this last rainfall event, but I'd love to see if there's new slips up there now. A lot of, yeah, okay. Yeah, okay, I'll have to get out there and have a look. So highly prone because you've got a lot of colluvium. Which I haven't mentioned the term colluvium before, but colluvium, you're probably familiar with alluvium, which is material that's deposited via water. Colluvium is just material that's deposited via gravity. So if you've got a landslip and all this material gets deposited somewhere, that's colluvium. It's deposited by gravity. It can be a rapid deposition like a landslide, or it can be a slow deposition of just material moving down slope. That means that if you've got basalt material, in this case, falling down and being deposited on top of sedimentary material, which has low permeability, water sits on top of the sedimentary materials, saturated the basalt, saturates the basalt colluvium, and then that can slip away quite rapidly. So slips are really problematic. They're really problematic to deal with. So trying not to have a slip in the first place is important. And once you've got them, how do we deal with them? Well, I'll leave that up to these learned gentlemen over here. But trying to determine where the likelihood of slips are going to occur and how you deal with it prior to the landslip occurring is really important. And some of the indicators that we've been talking about are old mass movement. Okay, that's a great indicator of potential future mass movement. Geology, as we've just been talking about, soil types are really important because a soil will tell you whether it's wet. How long in the year is it wet for? Okay, soils tell you a lot, so you need to be looking at your soil type. Cracking tends to be an indication you've got soil, you've got movement occurring at a site, you've got stresses within a site. Profile and site drainage, where water is moving, both within the soil and within the landscape, really important. And laboratory measures can also be used, some strength tests. But here you can see that all the trees lying downhill and posts lying downhill are a real indicator that you've got movement in the landscape. So if you've got something like that around, just be aware that it's probably prone, a site that's prone to landslip. Areas of old landslip, I just circled that cow there to give you a bit of an idea of perspective. Very large old movements there of colluvium. Soil creep. Sometimes I get called a soil creep, but this is quite a different soil creep. So this is where you can see that the soil is moving slowly down the landscape. Some people have in the past attributed this to grazing animals moving across the slope, but I think we've pretty well ascertained that that's not the case, because these occur where there is no grazing. So this is a long, slow, continuous movement of material down the slope. If it's moving like this under general conditions, if you get really saturated conditions, then bang, the whole lot can go. So there are ways to identify it, and I won't go into this in the likelihood of landslide. I won't go into this. Mike's going to talk about the identification of the likelihood of landslide. It just incorporates many of the things that we've just been doing in a quantitative manner. Slope, geology, material strength, water movement. Now, climate change is something that we haven't really talked about, but clearly our climate is changing. In this part of the world, we are getting higher, more intense rainfall events, which is going to increase the likelihood of our soils, our regolith being saturated in short periods, and therefore there will be an increase in landslide activity associated with that. So we do have to be aware that climate change is likely to be playing a role. Higher temperatures, more water in the atmosphere, a higher likelihood of getting these big intense rainfall events that we saw that led to this last suite of landslides. Management, again, I won't go into any detail, but planting trees. New Zealanders are really good at dealing with landslips. They've got high rainfalls and, whoa, this really jumps around. Okay, that's where we were. They're very good at dealing with landslips. I've got high rainfalls, steep country, and highly mobile soils. Controlling water on the surface is really important. So putting in surface drains or putting in subsurface drains. Controlling water on the surface and below the surface can be an important ways to manage that. Just another example of subsurface drainage there. Engineering structures. So this is slope stabilization using trees, using some benching and drainage. So this is at Thredbo. So of course this was where that tragic event took place due to exactly the reasons that we know that landslip takes place. In that case, the debris we used to create a road. Debris is even more mobile than colluvium. So the debris was used to create a road. I think there was a block drain that focused water into one part of the landscape. The site was overloaded. There were lots of buildings put on the site. So all of the characteristics that lead to landslide were in effect there. And of course, a number of the ski chalets went, and it has been rehabilitated to this using these mechanisms that we've just been talking about. Okay, I'm not sure how I was going for time, but I've done it. So yeah, that's the end of my show. And now you can get on to the interesting speakers. Yes, that's an interesting question and probably the only one that I can answer. John Grant.
Sorry, guys, while I'm trying to get the presentation up, my name's Mike Neighbour. I'm a geotechnical engineer. We have done some work. That one's not mine. No, that's. We've done some work in the area with landslides. We used, and what I wanted to talk to you about today is about how we assess landslide risk and how we compare it. And this system that I'm going to talk to you about is a system that was set up by the New South Wales Roads and Maritime Services. It was derived from some work that was done by the Australian Geomechanics Society before them, and it was a move to get everybody in the geotechnical world talking about the same sort of issues and talking about it in the same language. Now, what comes out of that is a quantitative or semi-quantitative way to compare what's happening on various properties. So, for example, the RMS, who have, even though they have much greater resources than your average person, they've still got a limit on their resources, and they have a bunch of landslides that they need to look at and manage, and they need to prioritize them. So they wanted a system that they could then apply, and it would make sense, and each landslide gets assessed in the same way. And I'll take you through this. Here we go. I'll take you through this in a minute because there's some things in here that really are quite useful, because it helps you hopefully in terms of understanding what the risks are, because risk is a very difficult thing to conceptually deal with, because we all have different biases and we all see risk differently, and it's hard to quantify. And if you survey people to find out what is an acceptable risk, you will not get an accurate answer, because the answers will be things like, well, what's the risk, the acceptable risk to me of my child being killed? And I'll tell you it's 0. But at the same time, 10 minutes after I've told you it's 0, I'll put my child in a car and drive it to the other side of Lismore, the other side of the Shire, whatever. And in so doing, I've taken a risk of maybe 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 100,000 that my child is going to die in a car accident while I do that. So you can't ask people what's acceptable risk. You have to go and look at their behaviours to derive it. And I wasn't actually going to talk about that, but it helped me get to the slides. So we're going to talk about landslide risk. And when we talk about risk is a combination of the likelihood of something occurring and the consequences thereof. And once we go into this, we can do a whole bunch of probabilistic stuff, which I'm not going to talk about because it confuses the best of them. And we'll talk about this. So we've got two sides to this assessment of risk: the likelihood side and the consequence side. So when we start talking about a landslide risk, the first thing that we assess, and this is where all the mechanisms that John was talking about come in, is that we look at what we call the detachment probability, which is essentially the likelihood, the quantitative likelihood of the landslide occurring. Now, what's happened around here, and a bunch of people in this room have been sitting on landslides that have probably got a likelihood of occurring of maybe 0.1, maybe 0.5, really high likelihoods. But there's other landslides that have occurred in the really severe events of the end of February, which are probably more like 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 type year events. The next thing we need to consider when we're talking about this likelihood side is there will be something. It'll be a house or it'll be a person. There'll be something at risk from this landslide occurring. So first we work out whether the landslide can occur. Then the next thing we need to work out is, okay, so if the landslide does occur, is it going to travel far enough to impact the element at risk? And this probably the best analogy for this is thinking of like a rock fall. You know, it might be a 1 in 10 chance that your rock's going to fall off the top of the cliff, but is it going to make it out as far as the road? And I remember one day on our property at Nashua where there was a rock and I just wanted to give it a little shove with the bucket to get it out of the road, and it rolled and it rolled and it rolled and it rolled and went down and banged into a few trees, and I went, that went further than what I anticipated. So we can, and there's some things that we can do around that, because we can use equations of energy and impact to throw imaginary rocks off hills and make an assessment of how far they're going to travel. So we can then multiply those two probabilities together to give an overall probability that if this event occurs, it's going to impact somebody. This is, I'm not going to read through all of this, but this is where I sort of say this method can be really useful, because if you do have a read through these sort of criteria, all of us will start to form some ideas in our head of, okay, if this does occur, you know, I've been watching my land for the last 10, 20 years. You know, it doesn't really happen very often. So these words that we have in here and descriptors that we have in here are designed to try and put you into an understanding of where you sit on that probability scale in a quantitative sense. And what happens in this RMS system is then we rate likelihood with an L1 being the highest likelihood to an L6 being the lowest likelihood. And, you know, L1 is something that is almost certainly going to occur at some stage. L6 is really, really unlikely that it may occur, although you may be able to see some evidence that some of the mechanisms that John was talking about before exist. So now that we've got the likelihood side of this sorted, we'll now talk about the consequences. So the first thing we look at there is a term called temporal probability. And that's really just, is somebody going to be there at the time this landslide occurs? Now, if it's, you know, particularly in an RMS sense, is it a car driving past? You know, so they'll rate, you know, a main highway differently to what they'll rate a country road. If it's a building, then the temporal probability is going to be 1, because the building's always going to be there. And again, this gives you a sense of some of what that means in a realistic, understandable sense. So now we've got our temporal probability and our vulnerability. The next thing I want to talk about is vulnerability, and this is a tricky one because there's a lot of work done in Hong Kong and some of the Nordic countries about, you know, where they do have, particularly Hong Kong, where they've had a lot of landslides, and how vulnerable you are depends a little bit on what you're doing. So if we could all imagine if there was a rock, you know, rolling down the hill at us and we're out in the open and we can see it coming, most people are a pretty good chance of jumping out of the road of it. If, however, we're in a house and it's a large soil slide that engulfs the house, then it's very unlikely that we'd be able to avoid it. But then again, your vulnerability depends on whether the house is just hit by it, partially damaged or knocked over. So we need to think about those vulnerability factors. And again, this is a bit of an idea of some of the things, and a lot of this, because it comes out of the RMS, they've made assessments of things like if you're driving along the highway and you hit some loose debris, you know, your vulnerability rating might be sort of in a mid-level thing, because you might spear off the road and crash into something that you weren't intending to. And again, we rate these. So what we do next with all those various ratings is that we look to combine them. So we've just spoken about the temporal probability and the vulnerabilities on the consequence side of our assessment. So you can see we were talking before, like T1 being the highest temporal probability. If we combine that with a high vulnerability category. Again, in all the way through this, 1 is the highest and the larger numbers are the lowest. So if you have a high temporal probability and a high vulnerability, you're going to get a very high consequence category. And this is useful because it feeds into that overall risk assessment. So now, from that matrix that we were just looking at, on the consequence side of this assessment, we've now got a consequence rating, and that'll sit somewhere between C1 and C5, and we've got a likelihood rating that sits somewhere between L1 and L6. So again, we go into the method, and it's got a matrix to help us make an assessment of how those things combine together. And the alternative to this is to actually, do a whole bunch of probabilistic stuff, work out, exactly what your likelihood of the landslide occurred is, work out exactly what the travel distances are, and come up with an overall probability. And when you do that, which is a full quantitative assessment, which is difficult to do and more difficult to understand than what we're just looking at here in terms of trying to, use sensible descriptive terms to slot things into categories and then using matrices to combine them. What we target when we do it in a full quantitative sense, and we have 2 concepts once we do this, we have the idea of an acceptable risk. And essentially is an acceptable risk is something that we as a society we accept it and we don't really bother doing too much more about it. And in a probabilistic sense, that's a 1 in 100,000, 1 in a million sort of ballpark. We also have a concept of tolerable risk. And tolerable risk is 1 order of magnitude lower, so 10,000 to 100,000. And then the concept of tolerable risk is, and we all, I suspect, have behaviours that fall into this tolerable risk category. And, like when we go bushwalking or driving our cars, we're prepared to accept a bit of a higher risk to gain some benefit from it. People go and climb mountains, and that involves a risk, and people will take, the studies have shown people take higher risks when they're in accept a higher risk when they're in a natural environment than when they're in an engineered environment. And the expectations once you come into an engineered environment are that, your risk is an order of magnitude lower than what it would be otherwise. So this does a bunch of that for you. So now through that matrix, the middle part of that matrix was the assessed risk level, or what the RMS call an ARL. And so you have a look at your likelihood, you have a look at your consequences, and this gives you an assessed risk level. And again, that goes from ARL 1 to 5. So the question there is, so what does that mean? How do I turn that into something that I can act on? And this is the sort of thing that people adopt. Interestingly, in the RMS guidelines, if you were to read them, they don't really tell you too much exactly about what to do with it, because that they don't want to be prescriptive about it. I presume they don't want to set expectations that if it's definitely this has to happen. But what we've derived there and to come up with the numbers that are those recommendations and suggested actions that we've put in there, we've done a quantitative exercise on the RMS method and then tied it through into the Australian Geomechanics recommendations. So we've sort of taken the Geomechanics Society's recommendations and sat them next to the RMS risk level. So what will typically happen is if you've got an ARL 1 or a 2, you'll be seriously considering what you do about it. If you have an ARL 3, that starts to get to that level that I was talking about a tolerable risk. And then the ARL 4 and 5 are, things that you might keep an eye on. If it's 5, you probably won't look at it again unless something changes. So that was pretty much that covers the ground that I wanted to cover. But if you are interested in this, because I know that some of you have, landslides on your properties, this gives you a mechanism to think, to help you go through your thinking in terms of what you do next. Because I'm sure some of you with the landslides that you're facing, these are large beasts. They're big and they're difficult to deal with. And, trying to make some sort of assessment of do I need to act? What are my actions? Can I move things around to take things out of the path and that way reduce my temporal probability, or can I set up some sort of barrier which may slow something, which, and play with things like that. And if you do those things and you go, okay, if I do this thing, I think my temporal probability will drop back to the next category. And then if you run that through the various matrices that are in there, you'll see, now, has that taken me, maybe I had an ARL too, but by carrying out this action, which changed my temporal probability, which then affected my consequence rating, I then took my ARL2 and turned it into an ARL3. So if you are interested in it, don't be daunted by it. It is actually, it doesn't have to be, we as experts use it regularly. And if you want to do it for RMS, you have to, do a course and be assessed, and, and they need to tick you off as being approved to do it. But that doesn't diminish its value, I don't believe, as a tool for some, for your average landowner to put yourself through a thought process that may help you with making decisions about what you do next as you hold on your property a fairly significant landslide event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. We've got Kevin Glencross here. He's just joining us a little late. And he's going to talk about ecological engineering.
I've got a presentation which will come up, but just as that, until that happens, I'll just introduce myself. Kevin Glencross. I do quite a bit of work with John here at Southern Cross and various projects, but also I've been working sort of on a range of different planting programs for a range of objectives. So I guess one of the things that I sort of feel like I'd like to convey today is really more about case studies. John's gone through, I guess the underlying geology, the structure, the elements that come into play when you're making decisions on your sites. And what I guess I'm hoping to do is rely just pretty much on photos and to dig into the details on a given site. So, we've got some really interesting sites that we could choose, but we've basically gone for this site here, which is at Terania Creek. So what I wanted to do is just sort of go through the process of what we did on this site. This site's been exposed to a couple of events as well. So I think it's, in that regard, it's interesting to sort of see how it's fared over the years. So this photo was taken basically just after the event, the first event. So we've had two, obviously. So the site's at Terania Creek, and it's kind of an interesting site in that it's sort of in the middle of the catchment. It's a site that's got a, not really sure what that's doing. Anyway, so it's a site that's, as you come into Terania Creek, heading towards Protesters Fall, so you're heading east. Basically, this is the view of the property from the road looking up the hill. So you can see there as a part of it, a planting program established by the Subtropical Farm Forestry Association. We worked with the landowner to identify areas that they were happy to plant. And then we really undertook a process of then going, okay, this is a site which has a range of challenges. So as you can see, it's got some of those benches that John was talking about. It's a site which had grown bananas in the past. So there's history, a legacy of slips from clearing right through to, you know, basically growing bananas. Quite often there's very little understory in those sort of systems. So the place is not only exposed to the extreme erosion of events as they come through, but just that slow degradation, the movement of the topsoil with even relatively small rainfall events. So we planted about 10 hectares in 2013, and then the area that was planted in 2016 had actually fairly significant slips in through it. So we had to deal with that at the time of planting. So that means very little access for machinery. So it gets hard to sort of use machines, tractors, so on. So then you've got to design a system which can sort of thrive or hopefully at least survive. But the other thing to bear in mind was, you know, 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, we had a couple of wet years, but we also had some really dry years. So the other challenge is the weather extremes, having a system that can cope with the dry times, but also has some resilience in those particularly challenging wet times. So just to give you a sense, Lismore, it's almost due north of Lismore, really just at the head of the Terania Valley. We like to sort of also, from a broader perspective, to sort of look at it, where this site fits in terms of the broader landscape. So you can see the yellow areas there. They're identified climate change corridors. So one of the objectives on this site was we wanted to sort of provide planting that provides some sort of linkages in the landscape. So you can see it's got the Nightcap National Park, so it's very close to some really significant, you know, key habitat, the World Heritage listed habitat. And this property is down the valley, so it's been doing a lot of heavy lifting over the years. Agriculturally, it was being grazed as well at the time that we established the planting. So some of the elements that John talked about, creep, was very, very obvious, but also there were areas that were really actively moving at the time of planting. So as somebody who's trying to select species and get a workable site preparation, site management, it provided a whole heap of challenges. And again, it's right in the middle of the catchment. So in a sense, you know, most of the conservation areas are quite steep. So again, you're dealing with areas that they may not be like Lismore in the sort of middle of the catchments, but these areas really get hit by very significant rain. And obviously this last event was a real test of the planting. So the other thing there, just to keep John happy as well, is we've got the site map. And what that tells us in terms of the soils is that we've got an area that is the podzolic soils, and then we've got some basalts, and then we've got some alluvium. So we've actually got quite a complicated sort of geology there to work with. And that helps to explain the benches a little bit. Okay, so again, just a closer view of that slip. So this was taken, you know, first week of March. And again, if you can sort of, it's not a great picture there of the topography, but you can sort of see the idea with the topography is it does show the drainage features. So you can see there's some incised drainage features, some little creeks that are quite steep that you can't actually see when we look at that planting. So those trees that you can see there, they're essentially those trees that were put in 2013. So they've had 9 years to really get established in that site and try and do what they can to provide some sort of mitigation against mass movement of soils. So the other thing that I guess presents a challenge is, you know, it's really hard to make decisions around species. And I really like the idea of, you know, in a little blurb, it sort of talks about ecological engineering and the idea that engineering is all about concrete and steel and timber, and trees can provide engineering. They have all the properties of engineering structures if used properly. So you have surface rooted trees that are good for holding the area around them. You have deep rooted trees that will actually anchor themselves. So where you've got geology that's quite complex, particularly sites like this, which can be quite rocky, you know, you need trees that have that ability not just to sit on the surface, but actually for their roots to go in and provide some sort of consolidation of the site. So we've got a range of species there that really, from an ecological perspective, they shouldn't be there. So what you can see, a lot of that tree cover is actually, that's river oak, Casuarina cunninghamiana. And generally, I'm sort of from out near Kyogle mostly, but they're the sort of trees you find in the middle of a drainage channel. So very rarely would you find them growing on a hill like that. You generally find the forest oak growing on those sort of slopes. We had some challenges. We had very little money. We used very little herbicide. We had to try and do the best we could. So I'd had some success previously at planting at Jiggai at a place called Bald Hill, aptly named. It was a west-facing slope, steep, just grassy, really no tree cover. And we tried the casuarinas there and they did really well. They sort of held the site together. A lot of people, some of the great regenerators who have been here, Mark and Ralph Woodford, have been developing these systems that I think are really, really useful in terms of mixing maybe you want to grow rainforest here eventually, but then putting trees in that mix that will actually provide you a transition. And that's the other way to look at it. If you've got a site, you might be working towards a long-term goal, but you might need to put some transitions in that sequence of going from what you've got when you walk onto a site to really what you're hoping to have in 20, 30, 50, 100 years. So river oaks pretty much have done a fantastic job of securing that site. The other thing I like about them is they're they're tall and they're not very rarely are they multi-stemmed. A lot of people use acacias and acacias tend to, they have some issues there. They quite often are bifurcated, which means they branch out and they provide lollipops. They provide a lot of shade, so you don't get a grassy understory. So we still had quite a bit of grass underneath those trees. So I think that's another thing to consider. It's not just about the trees, it's about what's growing beneath them. So in order to deal with the high intensity rainfall events, but also those gradual events, those rains that come and go. So, yep. Yeah, look, I think that's right. I mean, again, they need, a few casuarinas on their own cannot handle it. So again, this is really about the idea of getting not just one species there, getting a range of species to do that job. The casuarina does do a good job on they tend to grow in the middle of river channels and poorly consolidated, sort of gravels and so on. They'll grow there and they'll provide some sort of anchoring, but on their own, obviously they don't have the capacity, no tree has the capacity to do that. So I guess what I'm getting at is they have done a pretty good job of doing that, of getting the site, getting some deep roots into that site, but then you need to put in other species that provide anchoring and lock those together. We're talking about very dynamic parts of the landscape. I've got a site on the Tweed Valley, right really where the Tweed River hits its first part of the floodplain there. And, it's a really, really challenging environment. It took generations to create these problems. It's going to take generations to fix it. So there are no quick fixes. There are no single species that you could just do and walk away, it's the problem solved. We have to actually, try. There'll be years where you need a certain amount of time. A young casuarina or even a few casuarinas on their own won't be enough. You need to actually establish a matrix of roots, surface roots, deep roots. So this is looking at the top. So you can see there's the creek down the bottom. This again was taken just after the event. So you can see all of that material that's been deposited, that alluvium that's been building up on the floodplain there. But you can see what the job that those trees have done in terms of basically being at this stage 9 years old. So we've got a reasonable canopy cover. There is a mix under, even though it looks like it's mostly casuarinas, there's brush box, hoop pine, silky oak. There's a whole range of other callistemons and so on. There's a range of trees underneath them that are doing that job. So the casuarinas on their own aren't doing that job. So certainly I want to get that across. So this is the species list from that site. And I point to a few things in that depending on where you are in the planting, your mix will change. So I've highlighted a few in yellow which have really been shown to perform quite well at this site, but also at other sites. And, quite a few of those are species which grow in the active channels. So things like the sandpaper figs and the water gums, they can work with the casuarinas in those areas at the floor of our valleys. But I guess what I'm trying to say is some of those trees that have those attributes can be useful in other parts of the catchment, particularly where you've got decent rainfall and decent soil. Things like callistemons, for example, can be excellent on slopes. So again, it's just about within that genus, just selecting those trees that do that job, which is quite often multi-stemmed. And they tend to have those surface roots with things like hoop pines. So I'm a huge fan of hoop pines. I think if you look at any species that grows across these valleys, if you look at some of the hardest sites, including what John showed at on that towards the Cambridge Plateau there on the Richmond Range, prime hoop pine country, quite often a lot of exposed rock, not a lot of soil, really hostile environment for lots of trees, but hoop pines have the capacity to really get in there and hold those sites together, but they take a long time. So the other thing is that the river oaks might be useful in the first 20 years, whilst the hoop pines get their roots down and really can get that chance to occupy the space and hold it together. So again, it's about sequential in time, so that successional sort of approach. And they've done their job. Things like quandongs are really interesting because they can be really good and really bad, and casuarinas can be as well, because when they fall down, they can their roots tend to not penetrate down through the rocks all that much. They tend to have a root plate. And if they they use buttressing as well. So they withstand the forces of gravity and movement and water through just supporting themselves like you see on Notre Dame or those churches, the buttresses. So they have these sort of engineering structures which provide support. The problem is if they get undercut, and the casuarinas can be a little bit like that too, if their taproot isn't well enough anchored into the substrates, then they can come away. So this is where having a mix of those, of different stratum, different strata, so whether it's Slamandras, whether it's then your mids, your sort of shrubs, and then your mid canopy, and then your over canopy. So again, hoop pine, for my mind, is really one of those trees that seems to deal with the droughts as well. Because the other thing is, it's fine to do a species selection based on, we've just had 2,000 millimetres of rain, but 2019 was a really, really stark reminder of we need to think of extreme events at both ends of the spectrum when we design our plantations. So here's the site. This was in 2017. So that same picture of that site, and you can sort of see, again, we had a whole lot of really, really big, all of those little gullies sort of over, I'll walk around a little bit. So over here, we've got these gullies that have just had huge amount of water concentrating and flowing down. And over this side, even though there's a little bit of vegetation, there's still not enough cover for that vegetation to support and provide that coverage, the root coverage, to keep that soil intact. So 2017 was a really intense event, as you may remember. A lot of rain in a fairly short period of time. This was quite different. It had been quite droughty up to Cyclone Debbie, so we didn't have the soil saturation that we had with this event. So that's the other thing. You can sort of see there's a couple of areas down on that lower bench, that lower terrace, that are really showing a lot of movement there. So there we can have a look, compare pretty much exactly the same photo in 2022 and 2017. And we can see that it's really interesting that that area sort of that lower bench, this area in here, just this bench here, basically when you look at 2017, it was very active, but when you look at 2022, it's actually very little movement there. So the other thing is that different events, different sites over time, the trees might have helped that in terms of the vulnerability to that little terrace, there might have been a bit more sort of velocity taken out of the water, or the cohesion upslope might have helped. I don't know. But again, you can sort of see that an area that was not exposed in that 2017 event was really exposed. So again, saturation can be a real issue. And again, there's really no vegetation on the top side of that bench. The other thing is, if you're adding vegetation, you're adding weight. That's the other thing, because in this event, a lot of places, it just went to liquid. So the soil essentially was liquefied. So if you had trees and rocks and anything that provided more weight on that system, then you've got more potential for slipping. So when that 2017 event kind of went through, we identified a few areas, treated them each a little bit differently depending on where they were on the slope, what was there around us to work with. And then we identified things like, putting in more lamandras, really identifying, once we've worked out where the rain's going, not just putting in trees, but making sure we had some of those other fibrous root systems in there to sort of really deal with some of those challenging spots. So again, where you are in the catchment is going to really dictate as well what you do. We really, in the upper catchment, so I've got some pictures of the upper catchment coming up, but mid catchment is more or less, kind of it's upper to mid catchment, that site that we've just been looking at. And there's a whole range of different reasons why you might plant. But really, trying to get those upper sites tend to be on steeper slopes and tend to be closer to biodiversity sites. So they tend to get a lot of recruitment as well, whereas in the middle of the catchment, you tend to not. So this is right up at the headwaters. I've been lucky enough, I've got one property right at the headwaters of the Richmond River, and then for a long time lived in South Lismore at the very end of Leicester Creek. So this is very upper, this is the upper catchment. So you can see this, how steep this was. And then what we had here, the trees that are sort of piled up on each other. To give you a sense, that tree that's standing is about 80, 90 centimetres in diameter. That tree that's piled next to it is about 60 centimetres in diameter, big trees. But again, you can sort of see that, that tree that's actually columnar, those deep roots versus those surface roots, the plates. But the other thing that really was fascinating was at the bottom of this slip, some of those trees with the root plates had acted like a dozer blade. It had gone down that hill with the root plates and just basically pushed earth out. So again, very little you can do with events like that. This is a secondary forest filled with lantana. It's been heavily logged over its life. It hasn't been logged for the last 30 years, but just gives us a sense that we need to be thinking about this thing intergenerationally. Not that many kids here. There's a few here, but obviously we would want to put the work in now to make this less of a risk for those guys. They're going to have enough challenges. We could certainly be good for us to put in a bit of work to make that less of an issue down the track. I got this from Martin Novak. This is at Martin's place, Brench Creek. You can see that, really the vegetation is right up to the edge of this, but the velocity of that water is really, really profound. So again, you can't, you sort of need to identify these areas and strategically work out what we can work with, where our priorities are, and what really is, like to try and recover an area like that is a really long, capital intensive. It's going to require a lot of expertise to be able to make that site better rather than making it worse. And machinery is a wonderful, I've been involved with people who have the skill on machines that is really incredible to watch, and they have this great capacity for repair, but also, you've got to kind of pick your battles and you've got to be careful what you take on. This is just down in Lismore. So this is where Leicester Creek and the Wilsons meet. So this is like Velocity Central. So this is where the two major parts of the catchment come together here in Lismore, and that's why Lismore's here, and that's why Lismore has these incredible events. So again, there's a casuarina that was right across from where those two branches meet. So, and that's a casuarina, and and you've got callistemons and you've got, melaleucas and all that. This is a planting that's been done on that bank. So essentially you've got the two arms of the river come together. Leicester Creek is directly opposite to that. So that was getting smashed. So these trees withstood that, so that obviously, the council and the regenerators have put a lot of thought into that. It's basically, you've got that tall and you've got that, that shorter vegetation lower to the ground. So, in terms of a cohesion under those pressures, it seemed to work really well. So another site we've got, which is just around the corner from the site at Training Creek. This is just near the Shannon Tavern, just at Wallace's Road. And again, this really goes to the point that John was talking about, where you've got those contact zones, two different geologies close together. So here we had podzols and sandstones. So we had a basalt cap, the flat basalt cap. And then you've got this area of quite steep inclines. And underneath that was a bit of sandstone and rhyolite. We went and had a look, and what happened was underneath the basalt had been washed away. So then all that support for the basalt cap was lost, and then that all comes crashing down. So you have these sorts of events. So that's on the river there, basically. So that's Training Creek, and you can see that they've been scoured. So again, that was all planted out, and it's either underneath the sand or it's washed away. So, a lot of people are asking, what do we do? Well, I think, unfortunately, persistence. We've just got to hang in there. And I know it's difficult. In that catchment, people have been working for 30 years, busting their asses for this is their second generation. And it's really difficult to see that. But at the same time, this has really been a lesson on, we just have to stick at this. We can't just go, oh, well, it failed. Sure, there's been failures, but we can't not do it. It's such a critical job, and it's a critical part of the catchment. So these parts of the catchment contribute a whole heap in terms of sediment. They've got a job to do in terms of really keeping that material up on the slopes and keeping it out of the channels. You only have to look at the colour of the river and the colour of, the plumes coming out of Ballina to realise the incredible volume of material that we've lost, whether it's farming or environmental reasons. We cannot afford to lose this material. So this makes good economic sense to keep doing this. So that's looking down at the slip. So basically the river, you can sort of see that little dam there, that's on the floodplain, but basically that's really what we had. You can sort of see that this was planted in about 2014. So those hoop pines, they're about 6-7 years old. So they just really haven't had enough time to do their job there. But, again, what do we do with a site like that? Well, I think people like Jeremy are probably going to provide a few insights. But again, one of the things we do is with a site like that, it's actively moved, exposed rocks. It's very poorly consolidated. It's very soft. The other thing we can do is just start with things like Lomandras. They do a fantastic job. I think I'm pretty much done anyway. Yep, that's it. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jeremy Stewart. I actually feel like I should be up there. And I think that with all this rainfall and chaos, Emma and Josie have nudged me from up the top and I've tumbled down onto the stage. I just want to say thanks to the other speakers. It's been great. It's been great for people to volunteer their time to come in and talk about this really important issue. And I also want to say thanks to all of you to give up your time to come in and learn a bit more about this sort of pressing set of problems that are upon us right now. I've titled my talk Down Under for a few reasons, partly because I personally feel extremely swamped, and underneath this incredible event that we've all just been a part of. Anyway, that theme will run a little bit through the talk. So first up, part of the theme is I just want to make an announcement that our bus tour has been cancelled, I'm afraid. We're still looking for the keys. So this is the mired up combi. Yeah. The replacement bus. We are waiting for the assessor, but they say they're going to have to get through the whole of the catchment first before they get to us, and then we've got to look for parts in Lismore. But I just want to point out what survived here, this dream catcher. 70 metres of being washed down the creek, hit a tree, and stopped there, but the dream catcher survived. So that's us. Because we can't give you a bus tour, I think we're just going to have a virtual tour. And why I sort of say that I'm from the audience is I'm not an expert. I'm pretty much an earth mover. I'm a Landcare volunteer. I belong to a couple of Landcare groups. And I've just been out there running around doing what I can for the last six or 7 weeks. But once you sort of gather it all up, you realise the scale of the problem is actually, it's immense, okay? There's thousands and thousands of slips that have occurred in our catchment. I'm just going to show you some of the highlights or the lowlights of a couple of the sites that I've seen. And I know there's a heap more. This is Gungus Road, Nimbin. I've got a couple of little notes there, but pretty much upper catchment, as Kevin calls it. Pretty heavily timbered slopes, but probably disturbed. But just really heavy rainfall, really steep country. But that was absolutely smashed. We had the creek totally alter course and wash out all the road going up there. We had all the bridges go out. We had the Nimbin Weir, which supplies water to Nimbin, knocked out. This is just my estimate. I think there's hundreds of thousands of dollars already spent in public infrastructure repairs. This is a tip off from the postman, Jaeger Road, Kawangla. If you drive up there, you'll notice slip after slip after slip after slip. I've just shown a couple of pictures here. Here you've got, we've got here, there's slips up here which have moved everything, this person's house and everything. That's your property. Okay, sorry. Yeah. Wow, there you go. Yep. Yeah, wow. Yeah, and that it looks like there's been like a heap of earth moving gear up there working for weeks just trying to clear the road, yeah? Yeah. Yep. It's good you're here today. Cannibal Falls, they suffered a lot of slip action. This is a major one here coming into the community. You can see someone's road, it slipped out of that hill there. Huge amount of soil came down. This is another one on a macadamia orchard on Tunnable Creek Road. This just looks like a crack, but once you go onto this person's farm, you realise that crack is probably, looks like it's going to take out a section of hill, maybe 600 metres across by 800 metres down, ruin his whole farm. So pretty significant. It's also the same slip activity sort of happening all the way along Tunnable Creek Road. Probably going to cost a huge amount of money to fix. Terania Creek. There's a few people from Terania Creek here. Just a couple of photos. You've got major cracks in the road. At several points in the road, almost that they're thinking about at one stage that the top end of Terania Creek wasn't going to be accessible anymore. I think this is part of what John was talking about. Perhaps the road was built on poor material to start with. That's aside from a whole lot of other factors. This one here is where all the wash from Whian slips have come down Branch Creek and then have met the waters of Terania Creek. This one, whoop, getting my buttons mixed up. Just there. It's been partly cleared already. Yeah, so a huge job. So with this one, when the engineer called us, he said, like, I just don't know what to do. The creek's totally changed course. The bridge, the bridge is not like it's covered in mud, you know, like what are we going to do? So we had to then try and reroute the creek back to the bridge. So one thing that became really clear is, and it could be my bias, but trees really do help against landslips. So you can see here on Jaeger Road, even just these little ones here, just dotted, you can see the soil around them. Even just holding in there, everything else just seems to have gone where it's been steep and grassy. And up here, once again on Jaeger Road, or Vice Road, whatever it is, you can see that the trees have held most of this country up here intact, but further down where it's a bit weedy and steep and grassy, it's all collapsed. Another thing that was apparent was that we can make things worse for ourselves. So this is up at Terania Creek, a landholder. This is the road, for example, and it looked like exactly what I think John was describing there about problems compounding. So the road drains down this way. I think the pipe down here was blocked, so there was a huge amount of water coming here. We had someone's driveway also feeding water into this whole area. We had probably this loose material from an old logging road underneath it all. We had a very steep slope going down to the creek. We had another road coming in here. And this is the resulting slip, or part of it. I couldn't take a photo of the whole thing over here. That's your place. Springs, exactly. So under here was a spring, I think, when we cleared it. Yeah. So that was what they were talking about before about the water lubricating. You've also got up here, I think, some pretty poor guttering on the house, which is also adding to the issue, because what that's doing is discharging a whole lot of water very quickly onto the slope. But I suppose what I'm saying is you can, you know, and plus I think this is probably a cut here, an old cut from the site, and the slope, and that also wasn't really well vegetated. Also, what's become really clear is that remediation is extremely expensive. What I also wanted to add here, I had another slide too, was that what also was apparent was that I don't think we're just talking about landslips here, because we think about a slide coming down, but all the huge scouring we've had in all the creeks, and all the deposition of materials on people's roads, all the bridges that have been washed out, that's because these rivers get supercharged with huge rocks. Okay, so I think landslips actually increase the amount of material in the waterways, which then it's a domino effect. So perhaps maybe up at Novak's property there, the river was supercharged with rocks, and was just chewing out the bottom of that bank. And then that just made the potential for a landslip even more. So it just goes on and on. So this was a sort of summary from my little bus tour, virtual bus tour. Okay, so we've got a very high risk of landslides in this area. massive amounts of soil loss occur, massive amounts of rock and tree debris are mobilised into the waterways. Large areas of the landscape go through rapid transformation. Another thing which we don't often think about was all the habitat that gets destroyed. I just don't know what those animals in those creeks would do, or what the animals in those bits of vegetation that got slipped, where do they go? I don't know. There's an extremely high dollar repair bill to roads, fencing, power, water and phone infrastructure, housing, creek crossings and our freedoms. What seems to be is we've rushed in and we look at the critical things like, you know, our access and our internet, things like that. But I don't see a lot of people, except perhaps in this forum, looking at what we can do about the natural areas that have been affected by landslides. So I think we need to sort of step up to that a bit. What I think, and I think everyone's really pointing towards this, is awareness and strategic investment in minimising landslides is missing. We sort of, as usual, we're really good at trying to pick up the pieces and all jump in when there's a big event like this, but when it comes to 6 months' time and we've got to find some money in our pockets to perhaps put in the hard yards and do a big planting, then it's going to be hard to find. So we've got to try and change that bad habit. And once again, trees dramatically reduce the risk of landslides. Planning to work on landslides. I really liked the presentation from Mike on the risk analysis. It's, you know, it's a very technical, very sure way of going about it. You know, I suppose when I go to a site or talk to a landholder, I'd be sort of asking these sort of questions. You know, like look at understanding why the slip occurred. So you can try and see if you could, you know, like attend to those factors. How are you going to work on drainage? You know, that's a big one. How are you going to stabilise it? Is the slip safe enough to work on? We were having a talk earlier about stepping on landslips and going straight through them, let alone with a machine. What are you going to do with all that material? Perhaps you don't want to do too much with it at all. Is there a green solution? How are you going to heal the site up? Have you considered all the hazards in terms of going and trying to treat this slip? Oh, we're just going to keep going there. Oh. Okay, so I've mainly been just doing emergency work for the council, really. And this is just a few steps in the how it's usually approached. So generally you've got a slip like that. This one's on Terrania Creek Road, I think, just near your place. It's been cleared today, but pretty much the step is pretty much to all this vegetation. You know, it's hard to do much with the slip from a clearing point of view if you've got to clear it to get access with all this veg in the way. So we've got an arborist in there chopping it down so we can take it to another site. It's pretty dangerous, slippery, you know, dangerous tools, falling objects, things can be hung up. Yeah, so break down into manageable pieces. We've got some reshaping of the earth. So this is a fairly, you know, if you've got, I think this one's at Cannibal Falls community, where they've had an operator in. I didn't see the slip beforehand, I just went and took a photo of it. But pretty much what they've done here, because there's a road coming down here that the community's got to use, they've taken away the loose material and they've tried to stabilise the site by reducing the grade and also stabilise it by putting in these sort of water diversion drains, okay? Also, these help you get up and down the slope. Yeah. Sometimes you've got to be cautious how much you actually want to tackle. Here, this is on Jaeger Road as well, or maybe wrong road. But the council's been in here and they've taken away the slip once before, but because it's been so liquid, it just keeps coming down. So sometimes you might just want to trim off just the bare minimum, because as that dries out, that'll actually help reinforce everything above it. So just be careful what you wish for there. This is on Terani Creek Road again. So a couple of the other things is avoid heavy loads on an active slip, of course. There's what's called a zone of influence, which is like even though you're not on the edge of the slip there, so say that was the slip. If you go over here, obviously you're putting a lot of weight, even though there's dirt under your feet, you're putting a lot of weight just there. So it's best to come back a bit and then not put any heavy weight there, because it'll just crumble. What they've done up here is a local surveyor to put a couple of pegs in either side, like on the stable material and on the weakened material, and he was measuring what the slip was doing during the last sort of month or so. You can see here too, what we've done is we've tried to get water away from the slip. So, there was a big crack in the road coming down here, which if it rained a lot, had the potential to take on a whole lot more water, you know, put a whole lot, make the slip a whole lot more heavy and lubricate it. So we tried to shape the road so it went down there. We tried to stop traffic going up this end of it. And we also tried to seal up the crack so water wouldn't get into it. Some of you perhaps have smaller slips, like around your own buildings or whatever. I'm just gonna, there's heaps of engineering solutions, depending on what your application is, but this is probably sort of some small ones sort of appropriate to some of your challenges. Rock, pretty easy to source generally. Larger the better. You can cut a footing in to sort of help locate it on good ground and then go upwards. Obviously the angle of it helps. This is one step beyond that. So the advantage with gabion baskets is you can go up at a steeper rate. They're sort of tied in there. They're fairly labour intensive still. And if you have a look here, they're not just sitting on the soil, they've been dug in. The first course has been dug in, and then they're stacked. And also you see how they're stepped backwards. So that also makes them more stable. But we're sort of Landcare, so I also want to talk a bit about that and just point on a few of the things that I've seen out there with the Landcare sites, and there's going to be a lot of crossover with Kevin. Okay. So this was an interesting one. This is up at Cannibal Creek with this landholder who was partway through a re-veg site. Now, if you have a look here, so all the campers that are killed, but this is actually a wall of soil that's all moving down the hill. So the whole thing's moving down en masse. So I'm not sure, just a little bit of fine tuning there with strategies. Might have happened at any rate, but maybe there's things that can be applied here and learned here. This is Whian Road. So this is just down from a Whian Road, as Gilbert tells me. This is just downhill from our place. So the whole of Whian was cut off by this big slip here. That's what it looked like originally. The community did a great job of clearing it to start with, but then the council came in and they've left it in this state. So pretty much they've taken away all the large rocks and trees. They've cut a drain in there just to sort of break up the water flow a bit. They've pretty much just taken away the weight and the loose material and anything dangerous. But they've left it exposed still. So hopefully Wayne might give us some tips on how to stabilise that easily. One of the issues there is that, that a lot of the material was because the slip was worked from the uphill side, there was no real way of getting trucks in at that emergency stage. is a lot of this soil was just chucked over the edge of the road. And there's a little creek going down there, and this whole site was Whian Landcare site. And that was re-vegging, much like at the stage you can see across the creek there. So, you know, you can also see that the challenges here are there's a whole lot of soil exposed when we know that that's weed control going to happen, and also new plantings and maintenance. So that's something that perhaps we should be thinking about what we can do there. A note also that this soil is probably all subsoil, so a bit harder to get things started. This is probably the best success story that I've seen, and Kevin was telling you a lot about that, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about it, probably a little bit briefer. So working on Training Creek Road, I looked up at the hill at this site that I had a little bit of involvement too a few years ago, and I just looked at it and I thought, wow, you know, out of all the hills around, that held up pretty well, and that's a really steep hill. And you can see here, just for example, you can see evidence of a slip there, but up here, I think there's a little slip in this area here, but on the whole, pretty good. This is the Petrov site again. So I thought I'd go for a walk up there on a sunny day the other day, and that was really nice. We saw lots of happy trees on that slope. And I went back to where I worked on it, just to try and get a sense of what if it worked or not, and just remind myself as to what we did up there. But we think we did have a fair bit of advice to start with. So we got the brains trust out, and I think John was there, Kevin was there, there was Soilcon there was Landcare there, Emma, and we sort of looked at this slippage site, which Kevin was telling you about, and say, look, what's the best way to approach it here? And he said we couldn't get on it with a machine, but what we could do is try and protect it from extra water, like above it. So you can't see it now because it's whatever 5 years down the track, but there's like a 200-metre little drain that sort of followed the hill, came down here, and the decision was to try and discharge the water, because whenever you put a drain in, you think you're going to solve a problem, but you actually create another problem for yourself, which is concentrating water. But we thought, well, we've got to do it to save the rest of the hill. So we found a gully which was around about here, which was a stable gully, or a more stable gully than the rest of the hill. So we built a drain which we hoped would have enough capacity for whatever event was thrown at it. And it was it had a very slight fall, like maybe 1 to 5 degrees at the very most, because you don't want the water moving too quickly. And then it came down, oops, sorry. Yeah, okay, well, it came down to this point here. Once again, it's hard to see because it's all grassed up, but that's a good thing. Oh yeah, here we go. So because you're concentrating water and you're aggregating it, it's going to have a lot more power. So here we built something interesting. It's like an infinity pond, you might say. So it goes into a bit of a sump, and it's got a level edge along here. So when this fills up with water, rather than discharging in one small area and focusing energy even more, it sort of goes over the whole lot with a small sort of a volume. There's also a bank down here which is intact again, which then directed the water down into this gully. Yeah. Time. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So this is another good one. This was a vertical drop. Okay, we packed it in with the excavator, just layer by layer, and that's held, which is amazing. I didn't think it would. Okay. Bigger picture stuff. So there's heaps of stuff we can do, which I think is really important work also for all of you, rather than just deal with your own sort of issues in front of you. I think we also need to keep the conversation going, raise awareness, okay? Lobby for strategic investment, okay? There's an election coming up, hassle them out. work with your local Landcare group. Yeah. Build resilience into our community. Yeah, we found that in Whian. Yeah, it was really, really important. And another thing is let's keep trying to address the drivers of these extreme events, because they're only going to get bigger, I think. And the other one that I thought, which probably comes back to the Down Under theme of, you know, feeling like we're all one nation and we're all working together. Because if once we start pulling against each other, then we waste so much energy just trying to get through that. So, yep, that's it. No worries.
Okay, I think we're all talked out. I think we can open up to questions. So if anyone has any questions, just let the speakers know. And then after that, we'll go up to the little landslip, which is up behind this theatre. Wayne's after the questions. Yeah, so we'll just open up to questions and then we'll go up and Wayne will give a presentation at the landslip. Yeah. Okay. Do you want to do that now? Questions? Questions? Question?
Oh yeah, well, landslips are a natural part of the environment. Oh yeah, sorry. So the question was, what do you do if you've got a landslip at a site where it's not impacting upon the environment or any infrastructure or anything else? Can you just leave it to its own devices and perhaps do a bit of planting? And I was just going to say that landslips are a natural part of our environment, of any environment. It's just that we have probably done a whole lot of management that has increased the number that we have. So, you know, that many species regenerate in landslips. So they're a natural part. It's just that we have enhanced the number by clearing land. So it's perfectly fine to leave it as it is if it's not affecting anything else. Yeah, I don't think you need to feel obliged to get out there and start. Particularly engineering, as Jeremy is saying, engineering is expensive, and you're just using up carbon. Otherwise, so I don't think that's an issue. Someone else might have some comments. Wayne?
Yeah, I'd probably add to that with that regen's a really important part of this. The biggest problem we've got is that there's a huge amount of lantana in the areas that I've seen in the last couple of days. If there's any potential possibility to manage your weed in those areas and promote deep-rooted plants, that is your absolute priority. So in just about, I'd say probably 95% of the slips I've seen in the last couple of inspections, we've got two major problems. It doesn't matter the mode of failure, but they're quite significant areas, commonly at the top of a creek, causing erosion issues. We've now got further follow-on rain, unfortunately. The mass of the erosion that we lose, or the soil we lose during these events, is quite high. It's upwards of 2,000 tonnes per hectare per year. That's what would be local here, 50 tonnes per hectare in a rainforested area.
Yeah,
yep.
Probably a bit less.
Yep. So you're probably talking 1,000 times more sediment is entering the waterways, which is obviously a major problem for the infrastructure, the culverts, the creeks, the bridges, the whole lot. Everywhere I've seen, the biggest problem is they're large disturbed areas. Now, they're not typical go and throw 5 or 6 plants in. You're talking 4,000 or 5,000 plants per slip. You're stepping away from the regeneration perspective that Landcare would typically do with, sorry guys, but tube stocks and things like that. You're going into more revegetation, like infrastructure level, mining level type revegetation. That requires a new set of tools, hence the reason we brought the hydromulcher out to give you an example of what that does. It allows us to get temporary cover, so it gives us that 50% cover to stop erosion instantly. And if we get 50% grass cover, we can reduce the erosion by 90%. So that's a massive change. That then stabilises the environment. We stop the dirty water, we stop all the other problems downstream. And when you live at the bottom of the river, like I do in Grafton, we're seeing that sediment load coming through. As the water receded last week, we have 2 metres of sediment at the Sailing Club. So the roller doors are half buried in just sediment that's come down the river in this event. So you can imagine that's all come from upstream. If we can come up with ways to get rid of the lantana and any of those shallow rooted weeds, absolute priority, because they're not pulling enough moisture from the soil. The slips are staying wet for longer, therefore there's more risk. So your slip may get worse because there's no toe, there's no material at the bottom that's actually capable of holding it. And as Jeremy said, when you start removing toes, you're creating other problems.
So you can actually plant it without having to terrace it or... Yeah. So you can actually plant it without having to just anything, seeds, even poking seeds in will help?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously there's new technology out there. We've spent the last 7 or 8 years perfecting hydromulching and direct seeding techniques. Throwing a bit of seed out will work, but it's hit and miss. Obviously seeds need good soil contact to strike. You've got the issue of subsoils in some places. They're quite dispersive or reactive. They tend to crust, so they're hard for the seed to germinate through. It's always helpful to do a soil test or to get some decent fertilizers on there to get them that assist the grass to strike. And then you can go to the next level of aerial seeding if they're big enough. Yeah.
One question
Thank you.
here.
Hi, I'm interested to hear whether trees are more effective at stabilizing a slope if they're at the bottom of the slope or if they're at the top of the slope. So say you have like a slope, 2 exactly the same, one's got trees on the bottom and at the toe, and one's got trees just on the top, but the bottom is bare. Which one would be more stable and why?
Can I say rule 3? It depends.
Well, I think that so planting above a slope is effective because you're on a stable site and you're preventing water from. So it's acting like some of the drains that Jeremy was talking about. So you're sucking the water out of the soil right above the slope itself. So a lot of the water entering a slip site is below ground. So if you can remove that first and foremost, and sometimes if you're on an existing landslide, it can be difficult to get trees to establish. So you're better off to either include a planting above the slope or at least start with that and then progress down. I think it's more stable than going from the bottom, but it is a little site specific. I mean, there is a point where the slope gets so steep that planting trees has been shown to have a negative impact because they add mass, and the amount of water and the amount of roots present that tie the regolith together is not counteracted by the addition of the mass. So above, I think it's around about 60 degrees, so very steep slopes. There is some suggestion that planting trees is not a great idea, in which case you'd certainly be planting above that steep area so that the water wasn't getting onto that steep area where it's more difficult and more uncertain about the response to planting.
I just want to check. So if you've got a slope that's sort of 60 degrees and very steep, you wouldn't be removing the lantana, would you? I don't think you'd. Wouldn't it be more risky to have a totally bare slope than to not have anything, removing any plant, removing the water?
Yeah, that's right. When I said that, it's you've got to do it in strips. You've got to allow the new plants to come through. Any cover's good cover, unfortunately. You do need to promote and manage the deep rooting plants to allow them to thrive. because lantana will obviously outcompete most things.
I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more about drainage in relation to springs, not just diverting road or surface drainage, but if infrastructure is in a position in the landscape where it's at the base of a steep hill, is there any way to manage spring drainage?
It's a bit hard to know where the springs are underground because obviously you can't see them. So I mean, sometimes there's signs, but standard practices are pretty pricey. Like you pretty much dig a trench, and you can put geofabric in it, or like small rock and a line to then where the water can basically find an easier way out, and you can drain a slip like that. I mean, you can drain an underground spring like that. If it's in a road or something, you can also use a sock. So we used this on a job recently up at Standing Street, where there was a spring coming up under the road and it was pumping all the water up in the road because people couldn't get past it. So we tried to dig out the loose material, and then we put a geofabric, so which is you can just buy that from the plumbing store, or you can buy more expensive versions from a specialist store. And then you fill that with a rock, and all the pores in the rock then act as like a pipe, and then you fold it back over, and then you can build on top of it. Okay, so but it's really tricky underground water. It's usually caused by where the water that seeps into the soil hits something impervious, whether it's a rock layer or a clay layer, and then it can't move any further, so it runs underground. But it's totally random.
I'd just like to add in a few questions that are coming in from the live stream. So thank you to those that are joining us in that way outside of this room. Oops, I've lost my questions. Some more have just come in. Is there a greater risk where two soil types meet on a slope, e.g. chocolate soils meeting red soils? And is there anything in particular that can be done to mitigate that risk?
Sorry, man. That's you, John.
So where you've got a red soil over a brown chocolate soil, or the other way around?
That was the example, but
Yep.
yeah, in that intersection between soil types.
Yeah, so where you've got we sort of touched on that, where you've got a concentration of water within the regolith or within the soil, then you've got a point of weakness within that soil profile. So that's really problematic. It's a bit like having a sponge cake with cream in the middle. Okay, if you move your sponge cake around too much, the top slides off, and that's exactly what will occur when you've got that line of weakness. So all you can really do is try to get rid of that water, by putting in drains, planting trees, trying not to have that concentration of water, but it's a very difficult thing to try to deal with.
It's a massive effort that we've all got to try and achieve here, and we're all going to do our best, but I think we need some sort of Landcare approach for the area to help us out. I mean, I know in our place we just can't manage what's gone down. We don't have the people power to get rid of all the mud. We can't put machinery on our soils because they're too wet at the moment. So we can't conserve land. We can't sort of keep cattle out of lands that are conserved on our property. This is going to go on for a long time. So is there some sort of group that's going to get together to lobby for money for us, landholders that can, I suppose that's directed to the Landcare. Is that going to happen for the future, or the near future?
So Landcare's volunteers and with a few paid staff. So it's worked on so pretty much from my observation, there's a lot of people doing a lot of great things with just love in their hearts, So in terms of getting coordinated action, you know, that's something which everyone's got to pull a bit more out and go, okay, well, I'm gonna take this to my, as I said, try and take it to your local member and say, look, or take it to LLS and say, because Landcare is also funded by other agencies, okay, for that sort of work. So I would say take it sure to your local Landcare group, and they can work its way up the line, or just do a direct hit and go and see one of your local members or one of the local agencies and say, listen, I want some help. I mean, it's going to come, but, you know, I don't know when and how much.
But we need numbers. I mean, it's all very well if, you know, because we're all doing our best at the moment. There's so much to do. It's just another job. So I think it'll be more successful if there was a group that could lobby, if we could all form one group and to have a voice, rather than just trying to do it as individuals, you know.
Richmond Landcare will be collecting as many contact details of landholders that are affected, and I'm sure Border Rangers will also be doing the same, and Brunswick Valley, and we'll all be working to support you guys with grants and things like that. I'll give it to Emma.
Can I just say that this event today is a big part of that, and having being able to bring people together who all share that common concern and be able to say, look, we are, you know, there is a huge community that is at need. I had lobbied really hard to get Janelle Saffin here today, and I thought up until this morning there was somebody from her office coming, but they cancelled. So we've now lined up an appointment next week to speak to them and try and carry that conversation. I recognise how big this, you know, this is a small percentage of the people that are affected, and we do need this issue to be recognised, and we are trying hard.
So, are you happy for me to take it? So there's about 2.5 years ago, we had a significant fire right across our upper catchment, and I'm just curious whether there's any thoughts on perhaps tree dieback or death, loss of transpiration that may have further impacted the volume of water that came down to us. And I might be declaring my hand a bit, but there's a lot of interest in planting trees. A lot of people that have lost, I guess, terrain close to their homes. Fire service will certainly be a bit concerned about seeing people plant up in a big way right very close to dwellings and the like. Any thoughts to that?
Thank you. To pick up on the first point about dieback, I think the upper catchments in particular have been really decimated by a whole range of contributing factors and the loss of that canopy cover. So another thing to think about as well is the actual intensity of these events is also really amplified by the fact that there's no canopy to intercept the rainfall. The actual physicality of the rain is something that canopy does a job in terms of really mitigating some of the energy that comes down. And there's a huge amount of energy that came through in the actual, the showers themselves and the intensity. So I think then underneath that lost canopy, so quite often we're talking more about wet sclerophyll, ecotones, those areas that are in transition. You tend to be in transition, but fire is another complicating thing. You know, like we've been talking about Terania Creek, and Terania Creek had the 2019 fires, as well as canopy loss due to dieback, and now this event. So again, we're dealing with a whole complexity of interplay coming together. So I think it makes dealing with issues even more challenging, but we're talking about transitions quite often as well, transitioning. And we need, so for example, fire is a great example of being able to use fire to maintain eucalypt overstory and a grassy understory, which is quite a stable system. But you need a lot of resources to do that. You need to have, probably goes again to your point about what are we going to do? What are we going to prioritise? We can't do everything. We've got to pick a few things, and depending on where you are in the catchment, each different part of the catchment. So I think while we need to get people together, what we also need to do is think about what are our priorities in this catchment? What can we actually do? And we have the means and the resolve and the community support to do it. And what is just pie in the sky or is really not addressing our key issues. So we've got a job to do. And in a way, I hope that happens before the money comes, because quite often money comes without a coherent vision and plan, and money gets wasted. We can't afford to waste resources here. So I think that whole thing, we need to get into the catchment, identify where those areas are, what the particular pathology of what the main issue might be there. It might be lantana cover under dieback. We might want to actually use fire as a part of a remedial strategy. It might not make sense in some ways to a lot of people, but that can be a very stable system. So again, it's tree planting, managing native vegetation, but identifying where are the risks, where are we vulnerable, and targeting, being very specific about what we want to do.
Sorry, Jeremy, you mentioned LLS as being a possible group to lobby. I suppose there's probably a lot of people in the room here that actually pay rates to LLS every year. Whether we get a benefit out of it or not is depending on whether we're an agricultural enterprise or just just rainforest. Nevertheless, if you hold land, you'd still pay rates. Do you see LLS as being an important part of that lobbying process, or is it just another crowd that we can actually talk to and maybe not get anywhere?
Oh, look, I couldn't say for sure, but I mean, I think they've got everyone's best interests at heart generally, but it's just really like what I've found in my very limited experience is that if we can come together and come up with a project and go, there you go, this is a coherent project, it's got logic, it's got execution, these are the numbers, you've got a much better chance of them going, yeah, you've got it, here it is, okay? But there's lots of agencies which are involved in sort of catchment management, you might say. So I wouldn't just knock on LLS doors, I'd be knocking on lots of doors, yeah.
Just a quick comment in relation to removing weeds at this point in time. Probably the most important thing to do in any area is to retain the topsoil, because that's what you'll be planting directly into. So weeds are probably your best friend at the moment, and any planting should occur in very small areas where the soil is consolidated by weed cover or whatever cover you can possibly get in place. And the best thing to regenerate with is what occurs naturally on those soils, because that's what's done the job for 1 million years or more. So choosing the species that are particular to the types of soil that you live on is going to be a meaningful long-term solution to dealing with erosion. We've got an example where we live where a person has regenerated in a really wonderful way, but they've used tallow wood on red soils. And it's quite apparent that the tallow wood does not occur on red soils and isn't doing a good job. And it's just given away, it's collapsed. So the root zone of tallow woods is quite shallow. It's not a strong, deep taproot, and it's not consolidating the soils, the red soils, as well as the species that might occur in those areas. And just one more point, where the soil has already been lost, our priority should be to include species that are nitrogen fixing. So those species are going to improve the soil in readiness for other things that will come in naturally. So if we can throw seed of wattles and casuarinas into areas that are vertical faces and small fissures and cracks, and maybe hold that seed with very small branches, then it's really going to help in the long term. But holding on to your topsoil is the most important thing that you can do at this point in time.
G'day. are there some evidence-based resources that we can go to find species that bind their tap roots into the bedrock? And are these species being included in hydromulching techniques?
Yeah, so interestingly, through Kevin's presentation, I was counting the species list. The New South Wales Transport's batter stabilisation guideline that's just been updated actually has about 23 of those in their list as their recommendations. So they're a pretty standard generic mix. Most sea guys can do them. We can spray all of those quite comfortably. I guess the biggest one for a temporary solution in some of these areas where we've got fire risk is that we could be using things like vetiver. We probably haven't talked about that. Vetiver is a naturalised, non-native plant. It's a little bit like a lomandra, to say. Exceptionally good at deep rooting, tensile strength upwards of a similar size of wire in the root system. They can grow to 3 metres in a year in root system. Exceptionally good drainage material, so they'll pull water from very, very deep. They'll source water. Extremely comfortable in drought. Great pioneer because they completely hate shade and they hate Roundup. So you can get them in, get them growing, stabilise the surface so you get that erosion control and that drying out of these heavy wet soils that we've got, and then start doing some planning of how you permanently rehab those areas. That makes sense.
Thanks. I've just got a tip as a civil engineer to some of the people here who I'm sure will come across what I came across, and I'm sure that we've got lots of resourceful people here. But I needed to build a retaining wall bloody quickly after the first one because the slip was back to the edge of my shed. I lived in the shed, so it was pretty important that it didn't fall down the hill. So what I did is I got some gabions, which Jeremy showed pictures of gabions on his slides filled with rock. Now, I didn't have enough money to go and get that rock, and I didn't have the time to do anything about it. But just think about lining your gabions with geofabric. That's what I did. I've seen it done up near Tenterfield to a height of 7 metres. I only had to do it for 2 metres, but it worked absolutely fine for me. It's had 300 millimetres in one night over that since it was done. But it's just a cheap, quick way to get yourself a retaining wall, and you don't have to fill it necessarily with 3/4 aggregate like I did. You can actually just put whatever you want in there as long as you can compact it. So just an idea for you resourceful people out there who are confronted with a retaining wall problem.
Got a question come in from the live stream. On our property, we had a number of landslides. The larger one seems to have been initiated by the collapse of the top ridge. Is there any particular strategy for stabilising landslides on ridges? I think there was more to that question initially, but I've lost it in the stream. And I think there was a suggestion that the landslide had occurred at the very top, as opposed to along the slope. I can't offer much more than that, sorry. I know, and you know, the responses to these individual site conditions often need to be made with a view of the actual site specifics. So I appreciate it's a difficult question to answer.
Yeah, I think that many of these things are very site specific, even though there are generalities that we can, or general variables that apply across all sites. Every site is going to be different. And I think, you know, and it's good to remember that this was a pretty remarkable event that we experienced, where we had something like 800 mils out our way in 24 hours and probably 500 mils in about 8 hours. So, you know, it's, People are talking about various 1 in 3,000, 1 in 500, whatever. But regardless of what the figures are, if you do look at the stats, it's well beyond anything that sits on the prediction tables from the Bureau of Meteorology. It was a hugely remarkable event. But then again, I guess being a dinosaur and seeing a meteorite go overhead and say, gee, I'm glad to be alive in this particularly historic event as it strikes the Earth, doesn't give us much pause for thought. But I think it's good for us to remember that this is unlikely to happen again in our lifespans, unless our climate is so badly stuffed that that we've completely altered. We've reached a tipping point which is beyond our imagining. So something like that, getting back to the question, where you've got a slip from the top of a ridge, which was a little bit like the one that we saw at Whian, where you haven't got much catchment. It was just the sheer volume of water coming out of the sky that led to a particularly remarkable set of circumstances. It was a geomorphic event that we experienced that on a time frame that we would not normally expect to see in our lifetimes. So it's massive, and trying to repair it is what we're confronted with. I doubt that we'll see that sort of event again, hopefully.
So there is another couple of questions that have come in around, the land adjacent to the slip. Is it likely to slip as well? I mean, again, that's a really hard question to answer without looking at the site specifics. Am I right to assume that, approaching landslips and the edges to those slips should be approached with extreme caution?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I spent quite a bit of time yesterday trying to get my head around the numbers, the rainfall that we had. Quick case study, I looked at the casino rainfall for since October till yesterday. It averaged out about 2,500 mils. Out of that, we had 139 days of rain out of 204. So it's not the fact that we had these big intense falls, because there's erosion. I'd be like, well, that's great. Surface runoff will do what it does. It'll make some gullies. But when you get long periods of wet like we did, and long soaking days, so we had those days where we had 2 to 5 mil over the 24 hours, and a bit like today, we look like we'll get 10. These soils are incredibly good at infiltration. They take in a huge amount of water. So not only have we got a soil profile that's wet, but it's wet to very, very deep levels. I've seen places where water's down 2 to 3 meters, where I've probably never seen it before. So there's a huge amount of water and a huge amount of weight on the slopes. We need some sun and we need La Nina to finish so that we can actually start to recover. And as John said, I really don't think, well, I hope we'll never see this again in our lifetime.
So we've got a few other questions. Some of them are relating to riparian impacts and looking at the huge degradation on the creek bank as well, and what kind of responses or what kind of actions can be put into place to protect those creek banks from further erosion and start to restore them. Again, that's often a very site-specific response, where you've got some sections of the Richmond River where you've got, sheer 10-metre bank drop, and other places where it's a lower grade creek system. So there are some relatively good resources around to support riparian restoration. And following this event, I think we'll look to make those more available to people through links. We've also had quite a few questions come in the live stream in the challenge is that restoration remediation is incredibly expensive in most cases, as Jeremy has said, and lots of people are saying, well, what's the best bang for our buck? This is cost exclusive. What can we do with limited resources? So the hydro mulching, I appreciate for those on the live stream. I appreciate that we are soon going to go across to a demo site, and there is a landslip here on the university grounds, and we're going to look at some examples in context. That's not going to be possible for the live stream people to join us for that, but we will capture those suggestions in some way.
Speaking of bang for your buck, I just wanted to ask Kevin if you've had any experience with drone seeding and how, or either of you, Kevin or Wayne.
Yeah, I think drone seeding is a really interesting application in this particular context where Hydromulch, has done a fantastic job, particularly where you can get the machinery too. So the thing about drones is that you're able to get a lot, the technology is just evolving very, very quickly, and it allows us to get to places that are either, just not logistically possible. So it expands what can be done in some of the most vulnerable parts of the catchment. And I think that's really critical. The other thing is it will allow us as well, there's some talk about what can you do in the spoil from the slips, and they can be extremely deadly places to work, and they're still active. So they can still be sinking, and they're wet and swollen at the moment, but they will dry, and a lot of our clays are quite reactive. By that it means when it's wet, it sort of swells up, and when it dries, it cracks. So the other thing is when these areas start to dry out, they could still actually be potentially very dangerous to work on, particularly no machinery, like I think that needs to be, unless you've got experts, don't try and take anything on with your bucket and your tractor, because the risks change over time. So drones have the capacity of getting seed into those areas without those risks. And hopefully it's really then about those other, those other elements about contact with the soil, is there enough sort of mineral soil available to really give that seed some opportunity to thrive? And so again, and it's sequential. It's the sort of thing where you might just put out some things just to get cover. I mean, we're coming into winter. So simple things like oats and, there can be a lot of things that you can use that the seed is relatively cheap. You can get it, at your local store. A lot of the things, the ecological, like we've been to a few incredible local native seed, grass seed resources, so workshops and so on. But that seed's really expensive. It's hard to get. So that's the other thing is if you're a farmer and you've got a big slip and you've got things like oats or, whatever it might be, a good blend of seeds as well, then that's worth a go.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's 101 for infrastructural mining type things. The drone resources have been used extensively in the Hunter Valley for the last 6 or 7 years. I've used them in tactical re-veg approaches where I've had to get into an area that we physically can't access. I would always say that temporary covers, ryegrass, oats, things like that, use them every day. The biggest challenge is they're great for preventing weeds invasion. You're good at inhibiting that. The amount of seed you throw on, if you try and get a native strike, if you go over 5 kilos a hectare, you'll start to inhibit the native strike. But if it's a temporary tactical stabilisation thing, 40, 50 kilos a hectare of ryegrass or a little bit of couch in it will absolutely make that surface a lot quicker, stable a lot quicker.
I have a question. If we live in a world of dollars and trade, where does Australia sit with carbon trading? If it costs so much to plant, for people to have to pay to plant trees, why are we not going down a path where we can get paid to plant trees? I've worked in projects overseas where this is so successful, and whole hills are reforested by the local people and they're making a living from it. Granted, we have a more expensive dollar, but where are we sitting at with that?
There we go. I think that's a really important point, that there are some emerging markets for carbon, other environmental services, the loss of soil, that's costing the generations to come. We can't afford to lose that. So I worked on a really interesting project just on the edge of the Tibetan Plateau. This is an area that it's called low S soils, poorly consolidated soils. So they're essentially soft. And in the Cultural Revolution, the pines were completely removed. And there's been a project to reforest those hills. And it's been incredible to see when you have long-term planning. These plans were done for over 25 years, like that was the establishment phase, was 25 years. But they understood that the importance of the vegetation on their slopes was to hold those slopes together. But the other issue they have in that part of the world, and these are problems that we're going to have to deal with as well, is the water cycle. Trees actually, not only do they sequester carbon and hold our soils together, but they also provide transpiration, and they will provide the sort of cycling we need. So there are a whole range of values that reforestation provides. We've been very, very poor at measuring those. So it's very hard to go to a market and say, you know, we've been restoring this X number of hectares of riparian or slopes and coming up with some sort of value, what that can translate to a market. I think there's a willingness in the market. I think we need to get away from governments supporting these things. It's just, you know, I've worked on big government projects and they nearly killed me. You know, they're just so difficult. And again, the 3-year cycles are really, really problematic. So again, maybe if we can, through an event like this, do some baselines. You know, we need to be able to put a line in the sand and say, we came onto this site, it was a slip, we did this, we've sequestered that, we've stopped sediment. We need some metrics. You know, I'm a scientist, I'm going to say that, but we spend a lot of money on this stuff and we don't have a lot of evidence to back out what works, what we have achieved. And we've achieved a lot in this catchment. I think this is world class what happens in this part of the world in terms of reforestation and the willingness and the participation and all the people who volunteer their time. If we can't do it, who can?
Unfortunately, we've run out of time for questions, but if you do have any questions, you can put that in the email evaluation, which you'll be emailed, and we can put it to the presenters. We're going to head up to the landslide now, which is up a steep slope just behind us, and we're going to see Wayne do a demonstration of a hydro mulcher.